All right, this is the last part of the lectures for this week. We're going to finish up the discussion of geographically uneven development and talk about what are the implications for liberal democracies. So, what did all that about geographically uneven development, what does that have to do with liberal democratic states? Well, if the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, why don't more people vote out their politicians who are allowing that? In fact, why don't the growing numbers of poor people, or people falling out of the middle class, overthrow their governments through revolution? Antonio Gramsci came up with an answer to that, which he called hegemony. Here, hegemony refers to a situation in which there are class divisions, but the dominant classes, the owners of capital or other elites, they manage to persuade the subordinate classes, the workers, the poor, the peasants, and so on, to consent to being dominated. Gramsci found it wasn't just that the subordinate classes were afraid of the dominant classes. Instead, they looked up to them. Writing in Italy, he found that the peasants and workers often admired the elites rather than wanting to rebel. How did this work? He said that the state had two strategies implemented through two sets of institutions, the state and related institutions in both cases. First, the coercive apparatus of the state threatened those who might rebel. This apparatus includes the police, the army, prisons, those parts of the state that can punish people, that can force people to do things. The ideological apparatus persuaded people that some values were better than others, even when they did not benefit from those values. The ideological apparatus for Gramsci included especially the Catholic Church and schools. Now, these institutions might be teaching that it's common sense to work hard and not argue with your employer, and or that loyalty to one's country is more important than getting a wage raise. The Catholic Church taught in Gramsci's time in Italy that one should accept authority, the priest or the manager, the boss, and hope for a reward in the afterlife. Today's Catholic Church has some conflicts over such ideas going on, but Gramsci was writing about the Catholic Church in his time. Also, the church or others providing charity might be keeping people from starting a revolution. Many scholars today have drawn on Gramsci's ideas to try to understand why, when inequalities in a country are extreme, why the poor or the workers don't rebel. But then, in the 1960s, all around the world, there were protests and rebellions. Anti-colonial revolution in African countries, in Southeast Asia and the South Pacific, also the civil rights movement in the US, also student protests in Europe. Many scholars were surprised by these protests. For example, European thinkers could not understand especially why middle-class students in Europe were protesting. They called these protests and related cultural changes new social movements. This term was also used to describe the emerging women's movements and environmental movements of the 1970s. Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe used Gramsci's idea of a hegemony and revised it to make their own version of it, which we could think of as hegemony 2.0, to explain these social movements that were not just about poverty or class divisions. Instead of just thinking about class or economic divisions, which the Marxists focus on, they said there are other divisions as well. Some of them are related to class, but they're more than class. Women experience discrimination that leads to gender inequality and also other kinds of problems. Racism of various kinds makes divisions as well. Marginalization of LGBTQ people is another way inequality and injustice occur. And there may be other differences that lead to social, if not economic, inequality as well. Because of their use and adaptation of Marxist ideas, Laclau and Mouffe are often called post-Marxist. They called themselves radical Democrats because they thought that many social movements together could make a more deeply democratic state, and they disagreed with the authoritarian traditions in Marxism, like Stalinism. For our purposes, what is useful here is that there may be class divisions among the people of a state, but there may be other social divisions as well. Those social divisions may shape different nationalisms in a country. So to review, we have several different theories regarding how liberal democracies work or don't work and how they should work. The liberal or pluralist theories say individual rights are very important and states are neutral. Elitist theories argue that the elites should rule because the masses are too emotional and or ignorant, so the elites compete with each other to be elected to run the state. The state's not neutral, and that's fine because elites ruling is better than the masses. Marxists say that the state cannot be neutral because of capitalism. Miliband argued that the capitalists are the politicians, so they do what benefits them. Poulantzas said that even if the political leaders are not owners of capital, they favor capital because the state is embedded in capitalism. Geographically uneven development helps us understand this. If a state, that could be a city government, it could be a national government. If a state doesn't favor the owners of capital might move their capital out of that city or country. Gramsci also wrote that the state is not neutral, and not only that, it persuades the everyday people to go along with being dominated through its coercive apparatus, i.e. threats, and ideological apparatus, ideas of common sense or patriotism that persuade people not to challenge the powers that be. Laclau and Mouffe agreed that the state is not neutral, and they point out that everyday people are not just divided by class. It's not just the owners of capital versus the workers, or the rich versus the poor, but they're also divided by other social differences that might become divisions and produce inequality. Those other differences that could become divisions include race, gender, commitment to protecting nature maybe, sexuality, all kinds of other things. And another difference might be ethnicity. Next, after this, you're going to read about the case of paid sick leave in Milwaukee, a policy that might benefit a lot of people, but one that has not become law. So what happened? And which of these theories of the state can explain part or most of all of what happened? That's what you're going to do in discussion 3. So that's the end of this series of lectures. Please next go on to read the articles about paid sick leave in Milwaukee.